So today we're going to go over different forms of both the id and the superego, and how it's an assumption that one is pure, right? The superego as the moral complex, as the pure moral complex, while the id is the pure selfishness, the bad. But we're going to sort of break down that illusion here. And we're going to use the ideology of climate change and the idea of climate change as an object within society, as sort of an example and a backdrop to explain different shades of the superego and the id. And we're also going to go sort of segue into intersection here. All objects are the sum total of the things that make it up, right? And to break it down, to break down the illusion of the sense of reality of those objects, we're going to use the concept of intersection to sort of deconstruct what these are made of. So we're going to start with what climate change as an object and what it's made of, right? And basically what it's made of and what it's composed of. There are forces that combine to create the superposition of climate change or environmentalism as an instinct and as an intent within the collective, and the very conservative intent of preserving the environment as is. So the most obvious one is the intent of the superego, right? This idea that collective selfishness and collective waste has contributed to an impurity, right? Collective greed and ignorance has created this problem here that now needs to be purified, or else there will be retribution, moral retribution, in this case from the objective environment. That's a very superego-like concern, right? That sort of existential fear from the subject of moral retribution for its complacency and its vanity and its ignorance of the effects that it has for its personal ambition, for its personal selfish ambition. That's a superego. It's a direct reaction to the pure selfishness of the id. And with that, we also have the of-group morality as opposed to the in-group morality. So if the in-group morality, we've gone over this. In-group morality is all about preserving the collective from within. So rooting out any deviation from the uniform nature of the collective, right? There's a certain law and order and a direct antithesis to chaos that has to be enforced in order to have a strong collective. That's in-group morality, and that's the purpose of in-group morality. Of-group morality is the collective subject seeing itself for the first time. It's like looking yourself in the mirror and actually reflecting on the collective itself. And that allows for the perception that humans as a whole is contributing to something called climate change, right? This idea of man-made climate change. This is possible only when it's viewed through the lens of group morality. The in-group morality simply doesn't acknowledge this because it's not really interested in this. It's only interested in preserving order from within. So the different forms of the superego. And you can see both of these forces, because of the relativity of space, right? We're going to go over, and we have gone over, various instances to prove that space is relative, which means that none of these moralities are inherently inferior or superior to the other. They both have a purpose, but the space that they occupy is very different, right? But they are both manifestations of the superego. There's a certain moral component to both of these. There's a certain sense of personal responsibility that directly counters the pure selfishness and subjectiveness of the id. So you can see how certain ideologies, for example, anti-establishment, or leftist, or conservative, or liberal, exist among these lines of these forces, right? They're not a monolithic object. If you're dealing with ideology from within, and you're viewing the other ideology from the subjective perspective of the ideology itself, of course the other is going to be the impure. The other is going to be viewed as the id. But if you break down these forces here, and you break down ideologies as an object, they're going to occupy, in certain moments, these intents here. Right, so here, in of-group morality, in the form of group morality, you have, say, the collective as an object here develops its own subjective perception, the same way that an individual person will develop his or her own subjective perception. And the self-recognition and the self-critic part, the moral part of that subjective perception is the superego. And it's going to start worrying about the consequences of its own actions. So moving on to different forms of the id here. So the role of the id is actually not just to be the impure. So as we said in the beginning, the id and the superego here, the fact that the superego is the pure one and the id is the impure one, that's totally coincidence, right? To locate purity and impurity into a location, you have to acknowledge space and location as an actual thing. But these are not located in any location here. These are subjectively, the idea of purity and impurity is subjectively assigned by the subjective perception, which also means that none of these ideologies here possess the id or the superego in its entirety. Right? These non-material concepts cannot be located, and it cannot be captured and put in a cage and possessed by the subject, even though the subject would very much like it to be possessed. In a lot of ways, the reason why the id is associated with savagery, or the opposite of civility or intelligence, is because it's simple, right? It's simple, selfish subjectivity. And also, each opposing ideology, whether it's, if you talk in a general sense, it's left wing or right wing, each of them are going to point the finger at the other, their own elements of the id, in order to self-reinforce the perception that either ideology is the pure one, is the one of the superego. Each of them, of course, each of them do possess the superego in a different way. And again, no subjective perception can entirely possess the superego. And now, if you go from the subjective perception into an object here, and you say that there's an object that exists in the environment as opposed to subjective perceiver, these are going to be made up of various subjective forces, right? It's going to exist as at the intersection. So if you think of this object, for example, the idea of racism is an object. The idea of the institution All of these are material objects here in the subject's mind, so that it takes a physical it has a physical presence that preserves itself, and it convinces the subjective perception that it actually exists, that it's an actual real object, even though the subject has never seen it in real life. All of these are concepts here that coincide with various material objects, certainly, but these are objects that don't actually exist materially, except within the subjective perception, right? So if you look at all of these objects here, they're going to be made up of various other non-material objects, such as the superego, such as of-group or in-group morality, such as the life and death force. For example, if you take anti-establishment ideology here, what is it but the death force of the institution, right? It's in the name. The entire purpose of this ideology here is to be the antithesis of the establishment or the institution. So if we make an example here, as an object, what is it but an intersection of other ideological forces here? You can see this sort of rational process that can be used to deconstruct any ideology and break its spell over the subject, right? The subject buys into any ideology thinking that it is pure, that it is a version or a replication of the superego. But you can actually break it down into something that's less than the sum of its parts and loosen its grip, its physical grip over the subjective perception. So, anti-establishment ideology here has a superego component, right? It's disgusted with the corruption of the establishment, of the institution, of the in-group, right? Because, of course, the collective is selfish. The collective is inherently selfish, and that manifests and that shows itself and expresses itself within the institution, the politicians, the ruling class. That's a superego component of the anti-establishment, is to oppose the selfishness of the ruling class. It also has a component of the of-group morality. It recognizes the collective as a perception itself. And so it's able to see the bias and corruption of the establishment. Of course, it's the death force. It would be the death force of the establishment or the institution, or the current order, or the current center of gravity within the collective in terms of culture and politics. And it also has, in the same way that it possesses a superego component or mutation, it also possesses an id-like regression. So if you have civility or rationality or intelligence, there's always going to be a reaction force against it, because time is relative, right? There's an illusion that the collective is somehow getting more intelligent, more and more intelligent. But that's an illusion. Because time is relative, the antithesis to all of that, to all intelligence and civility and progress and purity, the antithesis to that is the opposite of all of those is also constant within the subjective perception. It doesn't matter what time it is or what period it is, every object is going to have its sworn enemy, right? Every intent of purification is going to be met with a certain impurity. And in this case, the anti-establishment is also a vehicle for the id to regress and break down everything that the old institution has achieved. as sort of a reflexive id-like reaction against what it sees as an impurity. And lastly, we can see the conservative ideology and the right-wing perception here is also a significant replication of the collective id, right? The resistance against change and its sort of unconditional defense of the in-group. That also creates a component of the id. So you can see many levels of the id also interact with many levels of the superego, such that no singular object here actually possesses purity or impurity, but the assumption of the subjective perception is that it has to buy into the idea that it possesses in this object or in these ideologies the righteous. Because in the end, the subjective perception has no choice but to try to at least interpret objective reality in its own subjective way. And finally, you can see it's the conservative perspective here, or the right-wing ideology here, represents the most dense part of the subjectivity of the collective in terms of its in-group morality. And so it is also a very significant manifestation of the collective id. It's the very id-like resistance to change and its unconditional defense of the in-group morality and the hierarchy that makes it a very significant manifestation of the id. So you can see different shades of the id interact with different shades of the superego, such that none of these objects here completely possess either of these. But the subject has to be convinced that it's going to buy into any of these objects and any of these ideologies here as vehicles to possess the superego. Each of these objects here are going to play a role as the life and death force of any other object within their environment, within their objective reality. And each of these objects are ironically going to develop their own subjective perceptions through the perceivers that buy into them, right? And the effect that they're going to have is going to manifest in either superego id and the life and death force of any other objects within their environment, right? In terms of the relativity of a space, each object can, in itself, within itself, serve as the subject to another object. And the subjective perception has to buy into either these objects or these ideologies here, assuming that these are vehicles for the superego, or vehicles for purity and truth, such that these objects, even though they're not material, they have a physical grip over the subjective mind, because they promise purity. And each ideology is going to point the finger at the other. It's going to try to point the finger at its sworn enemy and associate it with the id. But because of the relativity of space and the relativity of time, every object that plays a role in the life and death force of any other object, that process there is an illusion. The superego and the id cannot be possessed because of the relativity of space. And also, the life and death force cannot be located either because of the relativity of time, right? There's an illusion that the collective is going somewhere. The subject has to assume that it's going somewhere to a certain destination that is more pure than what it has right now. And so the only role, and it's in the name, the only role here is to play the death force of the institution and to oppose unconditionally, whether it's pure or impure, the object of the institution, which then allows this ideology here to play the role of the id. to be the antithesis of purity or intelligence or civility. So you can see each object or ideology has a chance to play the role in the intersection of various objects within their environment. And because of the relativity of space, you can assign the object and the subject to each of these concepts right here, these non-material concepts. And what the subject's going to seek is an object that it can latch onto to deliver righteousness.